welcome everyone to this conversation on the peace piece, um, using that play on words to describe the role of peace at the upcoming UN Conference on Climate Change, COP28, and doing so on an auspicious day, as today is the International Day of Peace, where we celebrate peace around the world, and I would add also mourn those who are still fighting for it. And so holding both of those things together as we share space today. Um, I'll share a little bit more background on how this conversation came to be a collaboration of many different people and many different groups through the Peace at COP28 community, which is a participatory collective of more than 120 people across more than 60 institutions and 5 continents, all with an interest in making climate change policy more peace responsive and conflict sensitive, representing UN agencies, community-based organizations, think tanks, academic institutions, and more. And this community has really been working together and collaborating in different working groups ahead of COP28 to try to elevate peace on the agenda and bring forward some policy asks, some specific and actionable policy asks that we're actually launching officially today, and we'll be sharing a little bit later on in this conversation. So that's an exciting component to come. This webinar also sits within a larger series, both that the Peace at COP28 community is running, and also that the Environmental Peacebuilding Association is running, sort of in a longer term trajectory ahead of the next conference on environmental peace building next year in The Hague. And so the path to The Hague is a series of webinars sort of leading up to that engagement. And so we have the benefit to be part of 2 fantastic peace-related and climate-related, environment-related webinar series. So that's where we sit today. And we'll start out with a little bit of an introduction from 4 panelists coming from different backgrounds and perspectives who are going to share on topics related to the policy asks that the Peace at COP28 community has developed. And I should mention that I think everyone in this community has much gratitude to Annika Erickson Pearson, who has been instrumental at sort of galvanizing and leading this community, making sure everyone is on topic. And Katie Waters has been instrumental in leading and kicking off this webinar series. So we're very grateful to both of their efforts. But with that, over to a brief introduction of the panel. So first we will hear from Hassan Yassin from the Somali Greenpeace Association. Then we'll turn it over to Benedict Kabua Madison from the Marshallese Educational Initiative. Then we will hear from Emmy Auma of International Alert Kenya. And then wrap things up with Harriet McHale Hill of International Alert, who will be the one to sort of officially launch the Peace at COP28 policy asks. And thank you to Annika for sending more details in the chat as we get started. There'll be more to come, more resources, more documents and information. So keep an eye out for the chat. And also feel free to start synthesizing questions, putting them into the chat so that we can have those ready to go after each speaker gives about a 3 to 5 minute presentation and overview. We will open it up to Q&A and are very excited to hear thoughts and questions and ideas from our audience today as well. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Hassan Yassin of the Somali Greenpeace Association, who is someone who works very rooted on the ground in issues related to climate, peace, and security, and is going to be able to share a little bit more with us about the practical aspects of the impact of climate change on conflict dynamics, some of those root causes, as well as how his organization is raising awareness on climate change issues and supporting communities in Somalia to take direct action. So with that, I will turn it over to Hassan. I believe Annika will be sharing some slides, and we'll get to hear from his wisdom.
Thank you. Thanks, Elsa, and happy International Day to all of our colleagues who are currently here with us. It has been great pleasure to share with you on the practical aspect of the impacts of climate change in dynamics of conflict. As I am speaking now, according to the recently data which the government of Somalia and also UNOCHA has formed, was that more than 8.25 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance due to the of climate crisis, which mostly those people who have been derived from their local-based livelihood and were forced to migrate from their homes. Among that 8.25 million, 5.1 million are children who are under the age of 5, who are also risk in starvation and malnutrition. Climate change is real, and it's also, again, need to appreciate that the death which climate impact is causing is equitable, again, the exacerbated conflict, which again is causing the same level with the climate loss of lives have caused in Somalia. So what is happening? The trend of climate change impact in Somalia, we have two major threats that comes frequently. The first one is droughts. For the past 4 years, consecutive years, the expected rainy seasons have not reached the country, causing destruction of farming systems, livestock productions, and also other economic, which was really relied on mainly on the rain. The other thing which happens is which currently disturbs about the floods. You can see these two pictures. One is a very dry area with two mostly vulnerable people who are also women. They are probably herding some animals to look for any place to graze for, but they can't find anyone. And you can see how the wind is blowing, how the land is dry. And the other part you can see again, it's a flooding area in Bloodway. So people are in between these two crises. They are either in droughts or in floods. Both of the times, destruction in livestock, destruction, loss of human lives, destruction of health infrastructure service, and all other forms human people who rely on living. So we have also, as a result of the climate change impact, this also, please, the first slide. The first slide, Anika. We are also facing high temperature and also sea level rising. Again, climate change is not only impacting on terrestrial areas, it is also impacting our coastal community. Somalia has the longest coastline in Africa with more than 3,300, that's 3 kilometers square. Along that coastline, people they are experiencing level of seas has risen, significantly contributing again all these problems that I mentioned, the flood, the drought, the extreme high temperature, are now significantly contributing the insecurity of the country. And also they are instigating communal conflicts. And we will see how they are instigating. Next slides. Above now, the current problem that I mentioned, the floods. So what is the result? What has resulted after the climate change impact? What is that, the result? So now the result is about environmental degradations. Most of the environment have been degraded due to the either looking as an alternative for livelihood destruction of deforestation is We have food insecurity in the country, shortage of water, loss and damage of properties. What has resulted is also loss of human lives, the most precious people can get, and also loss of livestock, which is the economic backbone of Somalia. Again, we are facing displacement of people and also diseases. As now you can see in these two pictures, this is one of those results, the displaced people. These are an IDP camp just outskirts of the capital in Mogadishu. Almost currently more than 1.9 million people have been displaced due to the climate crisis and also conflict in the country. You can see again that this elderly person who is feeling very distressed. You can see behind this picture, there are some camels, there are some goats and also cows who are perished due to the lack of water, due to the drought. This is the practical impact you are facing in the country. Again, combination of this, of displacement, of loss of livelihoods, have caused competition of the little resources. Again, remember, when climate change occurs, it reduces the natural resources which people depend on. So there will be a starting of competition among these resources or the little available resources. Well, what are these available resources which mostly causes the conflict? It's about the pasture and the water. Why the pasture and the water? Because these two things is what depends on the livelihood of our pastoralists and our farmers. They either look for water and they either look for pasture. So when they come together, point of sources where this availability of resources is very little, they start communal conflict instigates this. And it happened in the central part of Somalia, around the Gilgit region. It happened in far northern part. It happened in the also southern part. So this is how it is causing conflict. Next slide, please. So what is also happening? What else the existence of this now again? When people lose livelihoods and conflict starts, it makes people more vulnerable to join armed groups. Now, young people are being forced from their parents to join the armed groups in exchange of food. So what is happening then? These young people now have been trained to become gangsters. They have been trained to become terrorists. Now this picture you are seeing, almost, it is in 2017, almost 500 people have been killed in one spot. That's called Zobe bomb blast, and it is because by terrorist groups. So it's also, the other thing which is also causing is gender-based violence. When women get displaced in their camps, they sometimes face GBV. When they are going for a site for long water, they will also face GBVs. And also this underdevelopment according to this one. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Hassan, I just wanted to say this is fabulous, and I want to make sure we get to the questions at the end. So if you could wrap up in 1 or 2 more minutes, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. Then what are we doing? I think as I'm speaking now, today morning, we have planted a couple of trees in Begawa in solidarity with the displaced people to celebrate with them in the International Day of Peace. We are also planning to deliver a workshop later at 4 p.m. in our local time today, so that people can appreciate the nexus of climate change, environmental degradation, and also peace and security. Next slide, please. So we ought to also try also on, like, these days, our key thematic is environmental peace building. You can see this one, it was in 2021, 2022, we have celebrated. Again, here you can see this picture, we are also in 2029, at around the coast. to people to understand more the importance of environment and these peace days. We're also working with the security sector to understand the appreciation to protect the environment and their role. Next slide, please. Then these are also the work that we do, enhancing community adaptation and resilience to climate change through capacity building. We also do intergenerational dialogue on climate action, but we also empower communities, ecological and tree planting activities. Our work is also based on environmental education and awareness reason. We also do action for climate empowerment, advocacy, and campaign for climate justice. Next slide, please. And that will be the last slide. If you want to collaborate with us, we are open always. These are our contacts, our website, our Twitter. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hassan. That's very rich information and a good overview of the intersections between climate change and peace issues in a very specific context, but relating to issues that connect to many different parts of the world. So that's very helpful. With no further ado, I want to turn this over to Benedict Kabua Madison of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, who's going to speak to some additional angles of the intersection of climate and peace, perhaps touching more specifically on the impacts of militarism on communities, which is another focus area of our focus area of the policy asks to come. So Benedict, I acknowledge that some may not understand fully the links between military activities and climate change, but that's very important, and not just climate change, but the environment more broadly. So if you'd be willing to share more about why you discuss the military in this context, and then more about how you respond as well to integrate these two in your advocacy for the Marshallese community, that would be fabulous, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Elsa. I know I sent the, is that it? Okay. So we can maybe start at slide 2. Okay. So as always, it is an honor to represent my people's voices in these spaces, especially on two critical issues that are no strangers to the Marshall Islands and its people, the nuclear and climate nexus. And I'll try to get through this presentation as quickly as possible. So I was born in the Marshall Islands and lived there until I was 6. Our people have rich cultural traditions tied to our lands, the ocean, and the sky. Before our islands were designated the Marshall Islands by a British sea captain, for thousands of years, the islands and atolls were called Island Gaynad, which means these atolls of ours. And I is the word for ocean currents, in this case, the ocean. Lung means above, the sky or the heavens. Gain is the word for these, but it is also the root word for kainakan, or vegetations, in this case, the land. And so it is a holistic view of the Marshallese world, the land, the ocean, and the sky. And my ancestors were also caretakers of the land. They left certain islands unused so that they could be nesting grounds for birds, for example. When my ancestors arrived nearly 4,000 years ago, they cultivated the lands to grow crops. Those foods, along with the bounty of the ocean, provided a sustainable and healthy diet. And so our people also have a strong tradition of navigation and canoe building. Outrigger canoes could transport dozens of people in long ocean trading voyages. Master navigators taught their students using a metal or stick chart pictured in the background. The chart has shells representing the different islands and atolls, and the sticks representing the ocean currents. And so navigators use the stars, the winds, animal sightings, and the feel of the waves to navigate around the two atoll chains that make up our islands. Although only a few know these ancient navigational skills, there are efforts today to revive these knowledge so that our people can continue to navigate the ocean. Next slide, please. So as scholar Epele Uafa wrote, the ocean is a pathway, not a barrier. The Marshallese people today still utilize and protect the ocean. Next slide. So the Marshall Islands are in the North Central Pacific. It has a combined landmass the size of Washington, D.C., and an exclusive economic zone of nearly 1 million square miles, or the size of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Tony de Broom, the late climate ambassador of the Marshall Islands, used to say, and I quote, "The Marshall Islands is an ocean nation," end of quote, to emphasize that the archipelago is not just land, it is also water. Next slide. The Marshall Islands comprise of 5 islands and 29 coral-shaped ring atolls that sit on top of two ancient volcanic chains running from northwest to southwest called Radap, which means sunrise, and Ralik, sunset. The country's average elevation is 2 meters above sea level, which puts it at risk of rising sea levels. And then we'll skip the next two slides. So after World War II, the US occupied the Marshall Islands and selected Bikini and Eniwetok atolls for nuclear weapons testing. The first test was detonated on Bikini in July of 1946. Within 12 years, the United States conducted 67 large-scale nuclear weapons, resulting in ongoing biological, ecological, and cultural consequences. Next slide. And so on March 1st, 1954, the US detonated its most powerful nuclear device, Castle Bravo. It was 1,000 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Nearby communities were exposed to numerous nuclear fallouts a few hours after the explosion, causing extensive damage to people's health and the environment, including the contamination of water sources. Next slide. And so this photo reminds me of the flooding I experienced as a child living on Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands. I was about 5 years old playing near the road with my friends when suddenly out of nowhere water came rushing from the ocean onto the land. I remember the frightening screams of men, women, and children. I ran home to find that my house was flooded. It was at waist level. I would have drowned if I had stayed in that house a little longer. But thanks to my dad, he got me to higher grounds. But my story is just one of many. Next slide, please. So since 2014, the Marshall Islands has urged the world to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. 1.5 means a point of no return for my country. Despite numerous warnings, today's global temperature continues to rise, and the climate crisis is already here. With higher temperatures, we see glaciers melting faster than scientists predicted. This, of course, is terrible news for places like the Marshall Islands or the Kiribati, which are a few feet above sea level. And so most islands are less than a mile wide. The foundation of the Marshall Islands is corals, which are sensitive to rising temperatures. Marine life depends on corals. So if corals were to go extinct, we're also talking about no fish, which then contributes to growing hunger around the world. Fish are our main diet on the islands, so it would be devastating to the population. Next slide. So climate change is not only about flooding and corals, however. The media often portrays the Marshall Islands as disappearing. However, the impact of climate change will force the removal of my people before they technically sink. Climate change has resulted in more frequent and severe storms. Storm surges causes saltwater intrusion, contaminating freshwater stores and killing crops. It has contributed to drought in the northern atolls and is the main cause of increased mosquito-borne illnesses. Next slide. So today, the Marshallese people struggle with twin existential threats: climate change and the ongoing consequences of the nuclear testing legacy. The Rennet Dome on Enewetak stores 3.1 million cubic feet of nuclear debris from the U.S. nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands, which is this structure that you see here. And this is where we connect the twin issues of climate and nuclear. This structure has been leaking nuclear contaminants into the ocean since it was constructed in the 70s, as there is no lining under it to contain the poison that is inside. So for us Marshallies, the ocean is our traditional refrigerator, and so is the land. And when they are destroyed, it impacts our identity. The climate crisis will exacerbate the ongoing environmental, health, and cultural consequences of nuclear testing. In other words, these issues will break our traditional ties to our homelands by forced relocation and contamination. Next slide. And so lastly, if the world continues with business as usual and does not create a livable planet for all, this will be my homeland's and people's future. Even though we contribute so little to global carbon emissions, low-lying island nations like mine will be hit the hardest. We are literally on the front line of the climate crisis. People have told us that we should relocate, but Marshallese land is central to Marshallese culture. Relocation is the last resort. And our climate ambassador, our late climate ambassador, Tony de Broom, who was instrumental in getting the majority of nations on board to support the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, once said, and I quote, "To move us from our home is tantamount to asking us to eliminate a society from the face of the earth. We're talking about eliminating tradition, language of our way of life." End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for taking us from the beginning, from the tradition and culture, and bringing us all the way back to that at the end. It was a beautiful circle, which with so many interconnected issues in the middle, illustrating how the legacy of military impacts and climate impacts are really combining to impact the people, but also inspire this kind of advocacy and work to ensure that it's not the legacy of militarism or climate that remains, but it's the legacy of the culture and the community and the people. So thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm sure folks will have questions for both you and Hassan. I'm just going to note very briefly that there are 2 webinars connecting to these points of topics. One on November 30th by the MEDRC, focused on pieces of peace, building off of this, formal and informal pathways in resilient environmental cooperation in conflict contexts. And then the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is hosting a webinar on October 5th on addressing the root causes, taking action on military spending and emissions to advance climate, gender justice, and peace. And so with that, we'll turn it over to Emmy Alma of International Alert in Kenya. And Emmy, I welcome you to share more about your work and yourself broadly, and then also to dive a little bit more deeper into issues relating to business and human rights, climate and peace, the need for conflict-sensitive approaches to green investments and what that can really look like in application. So over to you, Emmy.
Thank you very much, Elsa. And it's an honor to be speaking about the work that we do in Kenya. I will start with a very brief context and then link these reflections to our experiences and work on climate change and engagement on conflict-sensitive business practice, and specifically our work around the Lake Turkana Wind Power Project, which, as we know, is the largest wind power project in Africa. And so the arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya where we work, especially around our climate action work, has over the years suffered really devastating impact of climate change, experiencing the extremes of both the dry seasons, but also the wet seasons and extreme flooding. And these regions are also associated by and large with recurrent conflicts. And one of the things that I think is important for context is that this context that are significantly underdeveloped. So their lack of development and their underdevelopment has been shaped by decisions that were informed by how the leadership of the day interpreted the conditions in this context, being arid and being categorized as low potential, and consequently, and I think there could be a number of people here who know about the Sessional Paper number 10 of 1965, which was basically a policy paper that defined how development processes would be undertaken in Kenya. And so consequently, you find that the policies then skewed development initiatives to other areas, and the communities in this ASAL climate affected context were left to their devices and largely marginalized. And one of the things that we learned from our engagement over the time is that with minimal livelihood options and their dependence on nature for survival, followed that conflicts then between these communities that also are largely mobile became inevitable. And this is basically the association of this context with recurrent conflicts. Over time, again, the worsening climatic situation, climate impact on the rangelands has negatively affected the livelihoods of those people, of course. And consequently, the conflict situations have increased in a lot of ways. We've seen this morphing into aspects of criminality, economic interest, and survival. And so fast forward to today, and the reason why I'm giving this context is with the growing conversations and interests around green energy transition, the rush to achieve net zero has interestingly then put a spotlight on this once neglected, unproductive, I put that in quotes, neglected, unproductive, conflict-affected context. So they have attracted a lot of interest. And the reason is because a majority of the renewable energy investments in Kenya are currently in these areas. So the potential for renewable energy, be it wind energy, be it solar, geothermal, has been recognized as really immense in these places. And so these once problematic contexts are now suddenly renamed as the frontiers for development in Kenya. So when we think about how we will achieve net zero and so on. And so one of the things then is that the scramble to get things going, unfortunately, and to achieve the ambitious visions that the country has, and the investment prospects has seen very little regard accorded to the social context, the fractures that have evolved over the years due to the aforementioned, marginalization, the contextual factors, the consequences that, have arisen out of the various concerns that have existed within this context. So for both communities, the rush to get the green energy project investments moving has seen consequences for communities themselves, worsening the conflict situations, increasing the rivalry, creating new conflict fractures. But at the same time, there have been consequences for these very projects that are considered crucial. So delays, losses, and overall tensions, even between communities and also the investment companies. And I think, again, the Lake Turkana Wind Power Project is a very good example of how, this delay is also costs a lot for resources that are already, earmarked for some of these actions. So unfortunately, the green energy achieving net zero has consistently been seen, and it is really seen, it is a solution to the climatic problems, efforts to realize sustainable development and so on. And so, but the problem is when it is seen as the bigger venture and little regard is played on the little, again, that is in quote, the little problems in these communities, then we basically set the pace for challenges that then become unsurmountable. So some of the things that we have observed is that little attention is paid for the most part on the intergroup relationships, the fractures that exist. Issues of the pressures on the livelihoods of these communities that have been neglected and marginalized over the years, the social and cultural context and the value that they place on some of these things that might not necessarily be externally seen as useful, including basically the pastoralism as a lifestyle and a livelihood in these communities. Some of the concerns are also neglected, things like claims to land and territoriality. Who is it that owns what pieces of land? And again, by and large, the land in these areas are communal lands. And so who makes decision around acquisition of these pieces of land for purposes of the investment projects to take off and so on. And not also recognizing that a lot of the conflicts have also been associated by the diminishing rangelands because of climate change. And so greater tensions between communities. And then this plays out when it comes to issues of acquisition and so on. And of course, I talked about the value system and so on. And so one of the things that, as we continue with engagement with the communities, is the question of to what extent do these green energy or these renewable energy projects recognize the local context and realize that even as we focus on the bigger good, the priorities of the communities also matter, and the local context also matter. And also the questions of whose interests are being delivered. And is it possible to match the interest, the bigger good, and the local community needs and the goods that are desired? And so because I just want to highlight 4 key things that as we continue with the engagement, we seek to have understood at all levels. One is that we recognize that the question of transition towards green energy presents the opportunities that are seen, including by our government, and that there's a lot of potential for this to lead us to sustainable development and build resilience. However, understanding of the context, the social cultural dynamics is critical. And so investment in green energy projects should be preceded by a deep understanding of the context. From experience, investing in in-depth context assessments and engaging with a conflict-sensitive lens is invaluable and can positively impact both the context, but also desires of the investment companies. Second is that projects understood to provide the bigger good should not further marginalize communities that have suffered over the years, especially in contexts where we realize that there's a lot of historical marginalization and fragility. The right to realize these ambitions and green energy transition ambitions should not be foremost, forgetting about what the local context requires. 3 is the rights and needs and priorities of these communities in the fragile and conflict-affected context matter. It should not be realizing the bigger good at all cost or at all cost. Instead, the opportunities for green energy transition should be an entry point to bridging the gap between communities that have been in conflict and connecting, these different groups for purposes of sustaining peace and also sustainable development. And finally, it is important to work with communities. The how of achieving inclusion, participatory processes, and mutually beneficial processes are best determined by communities with lived experiences in this context. During the African Climate Summit, one of the things that happened is the president launched the Accelerated Partnership for Renewables in Africa. And one of the things that he said was that a united front is critical in this particular process, and strategies should be woven together and tailored to find African solutions to African challenges. Communities and their lived experiences should be part of this partnership and a woven strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's such an important note to end on. And I love your emphasis that the means of getting to the solution of something like renewable energy is just as important as the end goal, and that we can't, lose sight of the middle part and the sorts of impacts that even, very important energy transitions can have for local communities if their needs are not prioritized or if some of that conversation is overlooked. So I really appreciate those perspectives. CIPRI is hosting a webinar on November 16th on not reinventing the wheel, what lessons can climate funds learn from development and peace building actors as part of this series as well. So that might be an avenue to continue this conversation. And so I'll turn it over to our final panelist, Harriet McHale-Hill from International Alert as well, who will help us to understand the policy asks developed by this community, rooted in our context of climate change advocacy going into COP28. So over to you, Harriet.
Thanks a lot, Elsa. Thank you for having me here. I think with such great speakers preceding me, we can now all fully understand how much climate and conflict are interlinked. So I think here we wanted to give you a flavor of why it is so crucial for conflict sensitivity to be included within climate negotiations. And as you know, for the first time this year, we have a thematic day that is dedicated to peace, and that'll be on the 3rd of December. And for which this group, Peace at COP28, we wanted to come together to make our voices louder and present a set of common policy asks. So I will not pretend to have half enough time to go into depth regarding each ask, but I strongly recommend you read them and maybe even join us in calling for these important actions. But maybe I can give you a little bit of context. So I think these asks sit under the umbrella statement that to have a successful implementation of the Paris Agreement, this can only be possible with a conflict-sensitive and peace-responsive approach. So we have 3 groups of asks. The first one is related to climate finance and climate action within conflict settings. So here I think we're looking at the need for accelerated climate finance and climate finance that is designed in a way that is conflict sensitive and based on human rights. So here we are referring to increased access by those directly affected, quality that takes into account volatile settings and allows for locally led approaches, and for these approaches to champion solutions that come from within the communities themselves. The second block of demands concern businesses that will be operating in such volatile settings. So here this has to be done, as Emmy pointed out, has to be done with a conflict-sensitive lens. We need to be looking at heightened conflict-sensitive due diligence in terms of a regulation perspective, and we need to ensure that a conflict-sensitive approach to the just transition, because a lot of these of countries that are in volatile situation hold great potential in terms of their lands, be it for extraction or production of energy. So for this transition to be just, local communities have to benefit from these projects. This includes full public and meaningful consultations with local communities and a right to meaningful remedies. And it is only in this way that all can benefit from the project itself, going from the communities all the way up until the investors. The third group of asks that we have concern the military sector, where we are calling for a clear greenhouse gas emission reduction target for military that is consistent with the 1.5 goal under the Paris Agreement, and also a reduction of military expenditure in order to liberate funding for conflict-sensitive climate finance for countries in fragile settings. Just to mention here as well that on the military sector, there will be a whole webinar dedicated to this to go into more depth on those asks. Now, I think a very good question at this stage would be great, Harriet, but none of these things are on the official negotiations agenda, which would be an excellent question. And I think, so why we are talking about this and how relevant is to COP28, I think there are various venues to bring this in. But before talking about briefly what elements of the negotiations these elements can fit into, I'd like to come back to the fact that I think this community, we are still at an awareness raising point in time where we still have to and have a lot of work in making this link between climate and conflict obvious to all, especially when you think about the fact that 70% of climate fragile countries are at risk or already in a state of conflict. And I think this is something that we need to hammer on at COP28. Regarding specific elements that are negotiated, in which we can feed into, there will be the global goal for adaptation, where the quality of adaptation is looking at being increased, not only the quantity, and that is somewhere where I think we can feed in the whole conflict sensitive lens. There is, of course, the loss and damage fund, which is a new opportunity, where we can call for the same mistakes that were made with climate finance or mitigation adaptation not to be repeated, the do no harm principle, including easy access, and a myriad of other elements that will also figure in a webinar dedicated only to loss and damage further down the line. And also at COP28, there will be a lot of focus on fossil fuels, which obviously leads to the alternative fossil fuels, which is renewable energy, where I think our line is, yes, great, we realize that we need an alternative, but definitely not at any cost. And in conclusion, I think I'd like to add that this is a time for building bridges, breaking out of silos, going beyond our usual circle and uniting under the banner of solidarity, where climate action is an essential ingredient for building sustainable peace. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harriet. And Annika just put in the chat the actual link to those policy asks that Harriet just beautifully overviewed. So make sure to check those out and consider the option of signing on if you're part of an organization that has the capacity to do so. And so at this moment, we have only about 12 minutes left following this really robust lineup. So I would encourage everyone to put any questions that they have in the chat. I think realistically, we'll be able to get to maybe one, or if we're very lucky, two, but we will consider all of the questions asked in future conversations and as food for thought. And while everyone is thinking about those, I will turn it over to Faith just very briefly to chat about a different initiative going into COP28 called the Nature Footprints Project, which is an arts-based initiative to bring these concepts into a new space. So Faith, if you could just, maybe overview that project for 3 minutes or so, and we'll get at least one question in at the end.
Awesome. I was actually to show the photos that we generated at COP28, but I'll just talk about it. That the photos that we generated that are going to be shown for COP28, but I'll just talk in 3 minutes. So basically, my name is Faith Mutegi. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. I am a journalist, but at COP28 through Nature Footprints, I am contributing as an artist, a photographer to be specific. So Nature Footprints is a multimedia storybook which will be launched at COP28. It amplifies the voices of communities affected by climate-related conflict. It also features participants of peace-building efforts like myself. So how was Nature Footprints founded? It was founded by Environmental Peacebuilding Association and Geneva Peacebuilding Platform-led community of practice on environment, climate conflict, and peace. And what's special about it is that it features at least 18 artists from all over the world, including me, and they have very diverse bodies of work. I am contributing photography, some are doing music, others are doing poetry. It's very diverse. And I just found out a few days ago that our work will feature in the blue zone of COP28. And so why it was very important for me to Nature Footprints was that I have worked in communities where I see what they're going through. And I have sat in forums where I listen to their global minds who make decisions. And it always seems, there seems to be a place where both don't get each other. So the communities don't get the decision makers, and the decision makers don't get the communities. So it was important for me to come up with images, because images speak to everyone, so that even in places where you feel like you don't understand, you can just see. And for everyone who's going to COP28, make sure you look out for Nature Footprints at the Blue Zone at COP28. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Faith, if there's a way for you to maybe drop one of those sneak peek images in the chat or share with us, we'd love to see that. But otherwise, it's a good incentive for everyone to get out to COP28 and see this project. Annika has suggested that maybe you could share those at the very end if folks want to stick around to look after we wrap up.
That's fine. Okay.
Awesome. Sounds good. So now I'll open it up to some Q&A. We have some questions in the chat already. I think first, since we're on this conversation, there's one targeted for you, Harriet, about how we plan to push these asks at COP. Hopefully that's a quick idea.
I don't know if that can be answered quickly, so I put my email address in the chat so that we can have a further discussion on this. I think it will be a series of activities. So a lot obviously will be concentrated on the 3rd of December. However, I think our goal will obviously be to hear something about peace every single day, so that it's not just mentioned as a thematic thing that happened on the 3rd of December. So I think the best way for this to happen is to talk to people whenever you can about what we're calling for. I think we will also organize a Twitter storm around these policy asks. That would be great to make more noise and obviously to get onto as many panels and talk about the links between climate and conflict as much as possible. But as we draw closer to the date, I think we'll be having more organization on what exact activities we are doing and how the whole community could get involved in those. Thank you.
Awesome. And Annika, did you want to briefly share that graphic just so we can visualize this as well? Yeah, awesome. So in part, this helps to answer the question in terms of the diversity of different programming and initiatives at COP, including this webinar series, a blog contribution to continue the conversation, the Nature Footprints Gallery at COP28, and then also press and social media messaging. So there's a couple different lines of approach there. And Annika, is there anything else you wanted to say about this point?
Hi, everyone. I'm in a particularly loud corner of the Palais de Nation in Geneva today, as it's the International Day of Peace, and we are going into the Geneva Peace Talks in about an hour. I think everybody's covered it really well, but I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm the sort of project manager going on behind the scenes and connecting folks. So if there are parts of that on the graphic that you're interested in participating in, just get in touch with me and I'd be really glad to loop you in. So I'll throw my email in the chat for you.
Awesome, thank you. And then maybe one question that in the chat was geared toward Benetik, but I'll open it up to everyone. The question as phrased was, can you please share which environmental or climate security initiatives the Marshall Islands are currently prioritizing on the global policy level? But I would be curious to open that up to Kenya and Somalia as well. And just hear again, very briefly, if there is one policy that these countries are prioritizing going into COP, or if not, why that might be as well. So we'll start with you, Benetik.
Thank you, Elsa, and thank you for the question. I know that for my country, the Marshall Islands, they have been pushing for this loss and damage finance at these COP meetings. Our climate envoy, Tina Stegi, as well as Kathy Jedno-Kitchener have been emphasizing it at the international level or at these meetings that in the case of the Marshall Islands, we don't have the financial means to deal with these climate issues. We are a small economy, and in fact, because of this relationship that we have with the United States, through the Compact of Free Association that allows Marshallese to come here to the US and provides assistance to the Marshall Islands. We depend really a lot on the US, but the funding that's provided to the Marshalls are geared towards certain things, not particularly for, climate change. There's also the Marshall Islands has proposed a global levy on shipping emissions. So the Marshall Islands has the world's third largest shipping registry, which makes it an important player in negotiating new shipping emission targets. And of course, the funds raised from this global levy, the Marshall Islands and other countries wanted to go towards addressing climate issues in the Marshall Islands and in other places around the world.
Yeah, thank you. I know loss and damage will be a big topic, and it's interesting to hear about shipping as well. Emmy or Hassan, if either of you want to jump in very briefly with maybe one policy of interest.
Thanks, Elsa. To us, what we are pushing forward is enhancing adaptation and community resilience. Any loss-and damage should be additional funding, but not the already promised one. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can also come in very quickly and say that I think Kenya has been championing a lot of initiatives around climate action. And so on 4th, for instance, the National Action Plan on Climate Change was launched, which defines a lot of things around how the country wants to engage on this. I mentioned the Partnership for Renewables, but also there has been a lot of focus on climate finance. And in fact, as International Alert, this is an area that we're very interested in because it targets all the counties in the country, looking at how climate finance, locally led climate finance actions can be better supported. And one of the things we're looking at is to what extent can this also have very deliberate indicators around conflict and conflict sensitivity by the very nature of the contexts that are affected. And so that forms part of, the loss and damages and how they see financing for climate change coming through. But I think if you'll allow me just very quickly to answer Thomas Reeve from Oxfam about the questions on the specific things around opportunities for building peace. And I think one is that at the very basic level, there has to be investment around conflict assessment and conflict sensitivity actions, identifying what are some of the conflict sensitive engagement processes that should be, but also that looking at some of these processes as providing an opportunity for quote unquote peace dividends, basically trying to connect communities and having committees and the associations that are engaging with the liaisons within these companies, cutting across the divide within the context. And this would be based on an understanding of the context. Thank you, and sorry, Elsa, for taking more time.
Oh, no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So with that, I will give many thanks to all of you for joining, for everyone who's been a part of the Peace at COP community, and then again to the organizers, Annika and Katie, as well as the Environmental Peace Building Association. And it looks like our wishes have come true with the opportunity to end viewing some of the art as a part of the Nature Footprints project. And Faith, please jump in if you had any explanation. Otherwise, we will enjoy them as they are and sign off as we need to do so.